Good afternoon, Leah. Thank you so much for joining us on the STEaPP podcast. How are you doing?
Yeah, doing well. Thanks so much for having me, Shira.
Great. So in terms of today's podcast, we are very fortunate to have Leah join us. But before I tell you about Leah's bio, I wanted to take a moment to introduce myself, especially for those who are new to listening to our podcast. So my name is Shirah Mansaray, and I'm an associate lecturer at University College London. I work within the STEaPP department, which is the Science, Technology, Engineering, and Public Policy department. But for the rest of the interview, I'm going to say STEaPP. I am a lawyer by training, and I've come full circle as I was once a master's student at STEaPP. And then I was fortunate enough to secure a scholarship from the Engineering and Physical Science Research Council. And I was able to study my PhD in mental well-being, innovation, and architecture. I'm also pleased that I've now completed my PhD and I get to lecture within this fantastic department with colleagues who've become friends and mentors. I'm delighted to host the STEaPP podcast and welcome all our listeners to our academic and policy community. For those of you who are new to STEaPP, this is a science, technology, engineering, and public policy department. STEaPP brings together policymakers, industry, and academia to design innovative solutions to society's biggest challenges. STEaPP collaborates closely with external decision makers to ensure that we are asking the relevant questions and addressing real needs through our education and research programs. Our vision for the podcast is to create a community of professionals and students who are up for changing the world. Over the next few months, we'll be welcoming a fantastic roster of impressive guests, including alumni, academics, industry partners, policymakers, and policy advisors. And with no further ado, I will talk about Leah. So, Leah is the head of engagement at Startup Coalition, where she leads stakeholder relations and orchestrates high profile events uniting founders, investors, and policymakers across the UK tech ecosystem. In 2024, she oversaw over 60 events, published 10 flagship reports, including the top 50 startup constituencies and an EdTech deep dive, and produced a startup manifesto ahead of the UK general election. She is also a UCL alumni, and she did her master's in digital technologies and public policy. And she's a former Ohio State graduate. She blends marketing, policy, and community building expertise. Leah is also known for creating breakthrough platforms like the Pitch in Parliament, a Westminster stage pitch day for UK startups, and is building new synergies between government and tech. So, Leah, please elaborate on this very impressive bio.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you. That was very kind. And genuinely, what I would say is the team at Startup Coalition is absolutely brilliant. And I could not do all the amazing things that we do when it comes to engaging with our 4,000 startups across the UK without all of their support and hard knocked efforts when it comes to the reports that we launch and the events. It's really just a great community to be a part of. My background really is politics in the US. And then when I came over here, I did my master's, as you said, in digital technology and policy at UCL and STEaPP. And then I fell into this role, and I have absolutely loved engaging with a wide variety of stakeholders across the tech sector. Our organization is tech agnostic, so we do not specialize, so to speak, but we do have pockets that we engage with quite deeply, such as fintech, climate tech, AI, health tech, so on and so forth. And we're really just happy to be punching for the ecosystem and advocating on their behalf to the government.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Lee. And on that note, I had a question which I ask all our guests. If you had to explain your role to a 10-year-old, how would you do that? And also
Yeah.
in less than 3 sentences.
Oh gosh. Okay. Um, I would say when tech businesses are starting out, they need a lot of people to support them. And my role is to ensure that their message is being translated to the government and that the government knows what their opportunities and challenges are to the larger economy and the UK ecosystem.
Great. That's a brilliant answer.
Thank you.
Yes. So I'll go into our first question, Leah.
Mhm.
You curated over 60 events in 2024, from roundtables with policymakers to large public gatherings. What's your formula for creating events that meaningfully bridge the gap between startups, investors, and government?
Yeah, I think the best way that we think about events and how, going into any sort of roundtable or panel, fireside, large scale event publicly is thinking about your audience. So for us, as I mentioned, we have 4,000 startups, scale ups, and VCs in our community, and just understanding kind of who each event is targeting. For example, if we host an event in Parliament, it's really easy for the policymakers to engage. They can always just pop down and say hello, which is wonderful. But startups really love the opportunity to go into Westminster. It's not their everyday office, and that is a real joy for them. So when we do events in Parliament, we're really trying to target those startups and give them the opportunity to be in a unique space. When it comes to party conference that happens yearly, right? We run a pretty big tech hub, so to speak, both at Conservative and Labour, and we've done a little bit at Lib Dems as well. And in those instances, roles are reversed. So the policymakers are out of their normal environment. You're in these places where a large ecosystem of startups are, and we try to ensure that the founders and startups that are in those areas are able to engage with policymakers that they may not get to see on a regular basis. So in that case, we're focusing on how we can engage the policymaker. And then finally, when we're talking about like those larger scale events, like most recently, we hosted Rachel Reeves for our summer party, which was wonderful, right ahead of the spending review. It was a big deal. And we just want to host something for the ecosystem. We want to get everybody involved. And that is one of my favorite things that we do every year. That's a mix of startups, scale-ups, founders, investors, and policymakers, decision makers. You list them, we got them. And it is just such a joy to be able to do something like that.
That sounds fascinating. And I had a couple of follow-up questions because,
Yeah.
it's not every day somebody has the opportunity to interact with such a vast group of stakeholders. How do you go about prioritizing who should be in the room?
I mean, I think once again, it's depending on the event, right? So for roundtables or panels, usually we try to keep the focus around a certain policy issue. So an example being in the climate tech space next week, there's London Climate Action Week. And so we'll be having 2 events that will be focused on identifying 1,000 of the fastest growing startups in the climate tech space. We're calling it the Climate Tech Index. And we'll be targeting that kind of group and ensuring that they have their time in the sun. But anyway, when it goes to a roundtable, maybe we're bringing in a top decision maker when it comes to AI, and we'll bring founders that are specializing in that policy area as well, or not policy area, but they're like tech sector within the ecosystem.
Sounds absolutely fascinating. I feel like your job is so much more fun.
I love it, but I know I can be biased.
Oh no, that's fine. So then how would somebody get such an opportunity? So talk us through how you navigated finishing a master's at STEaPP and then getting this role.
I mean, that is one experience that if I can emphasize to anybody who is moving to the UK and trying to stay in the UK after they complete their master's, is a real challenge. With experience in the US and a pretty good CV, I thought was going to have an easy time coming out of my master's. But I ended up applying for over 100 jobs and only getting about 5 interviews, 2 offers at the end of the day. And I ended up choosing what was then Codec, and we have now rebranded to Startup Coalition. But that journey was really tough. And I was really lucky that at the time I joined this organization, we were still figuring out kind of what we were doing when we came to scale. And at the time, we thought it was going to be building out more of these verticals that I spoke about earlier. And so I joined originally to do an AI and policy role. I wrote our first report on AI.
Wow.
And that was really hard. And the
Yeah.
government wasn't moving. And our organization realized that maybe my efforts would be better suited for something like engagement. And due to the fact that we kind of had massive scale at that time and startups were really starting to engage more and more with us, it was a good time for me to transition into kind of a role of external affairs and engagement. And it's been wonderful. But I know my journey is not as cookie cutter as some of my colleagues and peers who left STEaPP.
Exactly. And, speaking as a former master's student at STEaPP as well, I know when it came to considering what's next after a master's, I had to clearly reflect on actually what do I want my career to look like? And what's the next step that I can take that's aligned to that? So for me, I decided a PhD, and it was made possible as well through the funding that I received. But I know other students really grapple with that decision, and also that moment, I call it sort of you're in limbo, because you want to be practicing, you want to use all the knowledge that you've acquired from the masters, but then you also want to ensure you're in the right space, the right company, the right organization that's really going to appreciate all that knowledge and all the skills that you've built from the masters.
100%.
Yes. And the question then for me is, how do you feel some of those skills that you got from the masters helped you in your job when you started?
Yeah, I think probably the greatest thing that I've taken away from STEaPP, and given the fact that I went through my master's during COVID, so I was the fully online class of STEaPP's masters. And even that, the network and camaraderie that we built with each other has lasted me now 5 years out of the program, and staying in touch. And, a peer from the program reached out the other day and said, "Oh my gosh, like, I see you guys are doing this. I'd love to have a chat with you." And I think that that is just so wonderful. And the other side, when it comes to the more academic learnings, I just have a lot of reflections of the things that I learned, and things pop up still to this day that I think are really fascinating. And I remember I took one course by Professor Leone, and she was talking about gender and technology.
Yeah.
And it's something that really, like, and excuse the pun, steeped in me. And just when I kind of left and looked at some of the work that we're doing now and how it's kind of relevant back to it today, we're currently doing a report, or a series of reports, called Funding the Underfunded. And so we're identifying different groups that are underfunded founders, and how can we have tangible policy levers to enable them to grow. And when we're doing the female founders one, I don't know, it just kept coming up to the back of my head, all the things that we discussed in that course. And I really just loved it. Do I think it's something that I tangibly use, where I refer back to the final paper that I wrote in the class? No, but I still appreciate what I learned, and the scope that it gave me when it comes to then being able to look at this report that we're writing and have a good view on kind of what our position should be.
Oh, that's brilliant. And it's good to know that what you learned, not just from the overall module, but from specific lecturers and professors at STEaPP, still has a bearing in your day-to-day practice. Reflecting on my journey, and this is about 7 years ago, but I remember during my master's, there was a course that, not necessarily even a course, but there was a specific week that we were talking about social inequality and social justice, and how that shows up from a technology perspective.
Yeah.
And I went on to write my dissertation on the World Food Programme and its use of blockchain technology in giving out food vouchers to refugees. And that was, again, like I said, 7 years ago. But now we have this surge in AI and product liability. So what happens when somebody suffers a harm as a result of an AI model, whether that's an algorithm, whether it's blockchain, whether it's the various natures of AI and the way in which we use it. And when I reflect on that, I'm like, I managed to sort of forecast and understand the challenges, but the legislation and the regulations have not necessarily been as, what could we say, they have not been as proactive, or they have not naturally captured these challenges. So I think there's a really interesting and topical debate going on around AI and liability, and the social inequalities and how that manifests to different segments. Because I guess on one hand, there are certain segments within the population that are not as susceptible to the fault lines within AI and other technologies. And then there's another population who are more susceptible to suffering harm and injury from different AI models and how it interfaces with that demographic and that population.
Yeah, and we did our final dissertation as the group project, and we did it on cyber readiness for higher education. And I think back about that, and at the time, we all knew cyber awareness was important. But now, fast forward, talking about, your forward look as somebody who studied blockchain in its earliest form, and now, for us in the cyberspace as well, it's just continuously a struggle. And I'm amazed by how far we've come, yet how far we need to continue going.
Exactly. And one of the beauties of being at STEaPP is that forward-thinking nature that we encourage our students, but also the lecturers, academics, and our policy partners bring to bear on the world's biggest challenges. So being interdisciplinary, being able to have scientists, engineers, policymakers all working on a problem will usually bring some of that forward thinking and horizon scanning so that we are it's trying to solve the biggest challenges that we're suffering with in today's context.
Yeah, pretty big stuff.
Definitely. Okay, so on to my next question.
Yes.
Pitch in Parliament was billed as a first of its kind opportunity for UK startups to present in Westminster. What inspired that initiative, and how did bringing founders directly into the policymaking space influence both tech innovation and public policy?
Yeah, so Pitch in Parliament was an idea that came from our executive director, Dom. He really is such a visionary in this field of trying to figure out best ways to engage across the sector. And the concept comes from the idea of a pitch event is very normal nature within the startup, scale up, and investor kind of ecosystem and space. People are so used to going to a pitch event, and usually you're pitching an investor your idea, or it's a reverse pitch event and investors are pitching the startups to come talk to them so they can deploy their capital. It's very, very normal. But a lot of policymakers don't have the opportunity to engage with that. They're busy kind of regulating, legislating, doing all of the good work. And so we thought it was a really great opportunity to bring the pitch to them. And so how we ran it was we had one investor, one decision maker from like a department. Specifically in this case, we used the Department of Science, Innovation, and Technology. We had a policymaker who was a parliamentary undersecretary for the Department of Business and Trade. And then we had a big time founder who is operating in public services. And so we had 7 to 8 startups get up there, give a 2-minute pitch, and the policymakers and the investors and 120 other founders in the room really got to just hear about the opportunity that these companies had for public services in the UK. And once that kind of got the ball rolling, we've just had such wonderful feedback, and the policymakers are finally able to engage because it's in their backyard. Like they don't have to go far. And that is what we're all about, is breaking down those barriers to ensure that everybody is able the opportunity to kind of collaborate in the best way.
Amazing. I love the collaboration. I love the innovation there. And, really thinking about who can benefit from this experience, what would it look like, who needs to be in the room, leveraging ways in which, like you said, investors usually would pitch or startups would pitch, and bringing that to Parliament. I think that's a fascinating experience, and I hope there are more pitch in Parliament events moving forward. So I had a question on this. What nature of skills do the startup founders or the people pitching on behalf of the startups need to display to be successful at such events?
That is such a good question. I think pitching is hard. Pitching
Yeah.
is really hard. And I always joke, you need your elevator pitch ready just for yourself.
Yeah.
So imagine having your own elevator pitch, and then you need to explain like a technology and a business plan and what your targets are within the next 6 months in the span of 2 to 3 minutes. Like these
Yeah.
founders are incredible. And we were very lucky that we had over 180 applicants apply
Wow.
for Pitch Parliament. And it was so challenging to narrow down the field.
Yeah.
And these founders and startups were just so innovative. And I think what it came down to in the end, as we narrowed it down, is we really were just there for the best use case and for the most articulate founders. Because almost back to your question about how do you describe your job to a 10-year-old, a lot of these policymakers and decision makers don't interact with the startup and tech sector regularly. They have to worry about potholes and bus times and all of these other issues. And so when they have the opportunity, you really do need to break it down to them in very simple terms. And so that is what we were looking for once we hit that like high caliber of startups that applied.
Great. Just reflecting on some of the exercises and opportunities we help our students, that's deep, develop pitching skills. So do you feel that any of the exercises or opportunities that you had to participate in oral debates that helped you as an individual?
I want to say yes, because I think that they are an amazing opportunity to hone your skills. I think for me, coming in with a very baseline on how to communicate was really valuable. And
Yeah.
then it was about understanding like where you need to target your audience based on the room that you're in. And I think that that was where STEaPP really kind of stepped in and was like, okay, well, you have all of these modules and now you need to do an oral presentation for this one. And then you have to switch your hat and try this one. And I think that that is so valuable. And I would urge all students that are considering or within the STEaPP kind of vertical within STEaPP to really engage with it, even if it is really hard.
Yes. And I know it's hard, not everybody has the public speaking skills, let alone the confidence, let alone the information that they could bring to bear in conversations like pitching or oral debates. But I am pleased that as a student, when I was doing the masters, I was able to participate in those. I did have an added advantage because I did, study law, and I have been quite fortunate in having opportunities to speak publicly. But what I got present to was the different way in which academics speak about their work and their research, and also students speak about their research. Oftentimes, students might be thinking they need to include citations in a pitch or a debate, or they need to bring certain evidence to bear. But at the end of the day, it's all about how convincing you are, how confident you are, and how well you're able to articulate those arguments that support whatever context you're shedding light on.
Yeah. And
Um,
I think you nailed it as well when you were talking about talking like an academic, because when I went into the master's, I knew I was going to be a practitioner. I was not going to go back to complete another degree. And so being able to be in a room with different people that are able to articulate in different ways was a really great learning for me. And so I'm so glad that you touched on that.
yes, thank you. And what we're looking to do as well. So, as I said at the beginning of the podcast, I'm an associate lecturer on our MS program, which is going to be delivered entirely online. We do have asynchronous activities, we'll have live sessions, we'll also have opportunities for students to present their work to their peers and get feedback. And we acknowledge that it's not just the in classroom settings that facilitate these conversations. It's the ability for students to also have those offline conversations and build their own network. Like you said earlier, you've benefited, even 5 years later, you still have this strong network of fellow students that you can lean on and you can share experiences with. So we do hope that our future MS C students and also the MPA students can benefit from these skills that we teach our students at STEaPP.
Amazing. Love it.
Right. Final question. As someone with a master's in digital public policy and now shaping startup engagement at scale, how do you see public policy evolving to support tech ecosystems in 2025 and beyond? And which policy changes would you like to see moving forward or even advocate for?
Yeah, I think the startup ecosystem is engaging earlier and earlier with policy, which I think is in essence because, countries are regulating a lot of these technologies earlier, and a lot of them are very considered high risk in a lot of cases where you're holding a lot of personal data, or even, cyber awareness kind of going down that route as well, or defense in terms of national security. And I think that even in the next 10 years, we're going to see founders who are very aware of kind of what are the regulatory barriers that they're up against. And I think the UK is such a great case study for that, because we have always been quite innovative as an ecosystem in that space. So we were the first to do a sandbox.
Yes.
And we are so proud of the SEIS EIS scheme, which really helps get capital into businesses at the earliest stages. And I think with all of that in mind, I think we are going to be trendsetters as well for engaging with policy more. And to your second question about what are some of the policy changes that I'd like to see? Well, I'm going to give my little plug for Startup Coalition again. So we advocate on behalf of kind of three buckets, so to speak. So the first being access to talent, so immigration and skills policy, which I feel like so near and dear to my heart. And that is one that I will bang the drum on for ages to come as an immigrant in this country. The second, access to finance. So all R&D tax credits, SEIS, EIS, overall investment ecosystem, anything that can get capital into startups at the earliest stage, obviously super important. And then the final bucket is regulation. So that can be cross-cutting, like online safety, competition, the data bill, AI, so on and so forth, or it can be vertical specific, which I think is going to be the trend that we're going to see more. It's how do you regulate fintech versus climate tech versus AI versus health tech versus defense, And that is definitely going to be something that we're thinking about quite deeply, is how do you ensure that all policy and regulatory barriers are equal and clear and concise, so founders do not get bogged down by red tape or just confusion, because that is going to be really harmful in the long run.
Exactly. And thank you so much for that articulated response. My question, and it always boils down to the equity within which either startups are able to access that funding, or those who are considering starting a business or an innovation or some sort of tech are able to access that funding. So what could you say about the equity?
Yeah, so access to capital is one of the hardest buckets, because a lot of it is out of our control, right? Like a lot of it is talking about how can we continue to push the government to see the opportunities in public-private partnerships? How can we lean on them to look at their deployment of capital into different ways? And so the BBB is a great example. Innovate UK is another great example. And so what we're doing is, talking about founders across the board, and diversity is, as the funding the underfunded is hopefully targeting, is how does it become equitable, like equal in the way that it is deployed. And not going to lie to you, it is one of the hardest challenges, because especially when it comes to like the employment bill, like you cannot discriminate against, if you want to do like a female founders fund, well, you can't necessarily discriminate with government money. So therefore, like, how do you kind of figure out which side and how you do that? But all is to say that it's a huge issue. We definitely do a lot of thinking on it, and hopefully there will be even more to come in the weeks ahead with the government obviously deploying from the spending review that happened last week, and then the industrial strategy that's coming in the next couple of weeks as well.
Amazing. Thank you for that. And it's reassuring to hear that there is, a lot of effort being put into bridging the inequity that oftentimes is a headline when we are thinking of funding, and especially what you said around funding the underfunded. Two questions. One is some of the terms you use, some of our listeners might not be familiar with them. So my question is, what is sandbox and what is BBB?
Okay. Yes. BBB is the easiest one. So the BBB is the British bank. They hold a lot of the capital in which that they can be employed into different funds across the ecosystem. And then what was the second one? I'm sorry.
Sandbox.
Oh, a sandbox, a regulatory sandbox. Yes. So a sandbox is the opportunity for early stage startups to enter almost like safe space for them to test their technologies in front of a regulator so they can figure out, like, are they compliant with a lot of the regulations in which that specific regulator wants to kind of have on the ecosystem. So the earliest one is the FCA sandbox, which was for financial services.
Yes.
And now it's kind of been deployed across different sectors as well.
Oh, fascinating. Yes, it's a good thing that we asked for this, because when you hear a sandbox, if you have a child, you're probably thinking something to do with sand.
Yeah, but it's the safety net, right? Like, if they're
Exactly.
playing in the sandbox, that's where they're at. And I think that's
Exactly.
a good one. And then the other example is just thinking back and reflecting on your question about equity and some of the access to finance. The other thing that kind of happened in the last couple of years was, we have a great angel network here in the UK. And one of the things that we pride ourselves on is the fact that we are able to allow high investing individuals the opportunity to invest. And we did a lot of work to protect that a couple of years ago when they tried to increase the threshold, and that was going to kill diversity within the early stage ecosystem, because, a lot of those angels can also be women or they're regional. And if you increase that, the salary of women across the world is obviously lower. And if you look at the regions across the UK, the salaries are not as high there either. So that's also something that we've really advocated for. And thankfully, we had a full reversal in the end, but that's probably a great example of it as well.
Oh, that's brilliant. Speaking of angel investors, now I know from my own research, my research was on mental health, sustainability, and architecture, and I looked specifically at hospitals. In Uganda, Uganda was one of my case study countries. I also looked at the UK, but in Uganda, we do have an influx of angel investors who are building hospitals, and they're using sustainable models. They're using their own ideas of technology. There are some elements of co-creation where they talk to local stakeholders, and there are also some other elements where sometimes they don't. So I think call to action would be for anyone considering being an angel investor or who is currently an angel investor to reflect on the power dynamics that take place when one is the funder and the other one is a recipient, and how you co-create that product or that innovation, so that as much as the funder will always have more power, I imagine, but how do you share power? What's that equity like when it comes to sharing power?
For sure. I can agree. I think angels are a lifeblood to the ecosystem. So 1000%.
Perfect. So yes, I think that was it for me on my questions. I do have a question that was asked from the previous guest that I want to forward on
Goodness.
to you.
Okay.
So their question is, why did you embark on your research journey? So reflect on why you chose to do an MSc, and why did you think of STEaPP as a place to do it?
Yes. So this goes back to 2020. As I mentioned earlier, was working in politics in the US, and specifically, I was based on Joe Biden's campaign in 2020, and then COVID happened. And they pretty much were like, well, we're taking the campaign digital, and either get on board or get off the ride. And the uncertainty that was going on at that point, we didn't know who was going to be our next president. I didn't feel comfortable going back to DC. And so I did what I joke is a panic master's. And due to the time in which I was applying, there were very few opportunities and options for me. but
Yes.
one was at UCL, because what's absolutely brilliant about European universities is that you are able to apply later. And that's such a great thing, because it allows you more time to think about what you want to do. And I knew I always wanted to live and work abroad. And knowing that I did later want to pivot into tech, and specifically tech policy, seeing that STEaPP had a program literally called Digital Technology and Public Policy, I was like,
I
stop.
know. Yeah.
I I was so fast to email Irina, who I believe is still at STEaPP, and just like, I'm obsessed. What can I do? And just fingers crossed that I got in. And
Excellent.
when I did, it completely changed the trajectory of my career, and I am forever grateful for it.
Oh, that's a fascinating story, and reflect on my journey when I thought about doing a master's. So I was at that critical point where I still wanted to be a lawyer and progress my legal career, but I'd also done some work in the philanthropy and charity sector. And I was looking for a master's that was interdisciplinary, that could allow me to leverage my legal skills, my humanitarian skills, and some of the key challenges that I had identified within the mental health space. So I found this master's and I was like, there is a master's in public administration within an engineering faculty and within a STEaPP department. Like it was so innovative and exciting. And
Yeah.
I emailed Jakob. Jakob was one of the leaders on the development, technology and public policy master stream that I did. And obviously, like, I did the master's, I got a lot of support during the master's, but I always tell students to think outside the box and to be ambitious and to think big about what they want their research journey to look like. There are other programs out there that tick certain boxes, but I'm always, singing off the rooftop around the interdisciplinary nature, the policy lens, the fact that you get case studies that are from different countries all over the globe. We get international students. So it's a really diverse community and very forward thinking.
Yeah. And to add to that as well as the community and the globalness of UCL and STEaPP in general is, and the UK is the plug, right? Is that, what I said is I wanted to live and work in the UK, and the opportunity to come do my master's and then become a practitioner in the UK for 2 years on the graduate scheme was just an opportunity of a lifetime.
Fantastic. And thank you so much for being one of our alumni and considering that you finished your master's, you went on to work. I managed to reach out to you. You agreed to be on our podcast. So thank you so much. My final question is, what would you ask our next guest?
So here we go. I am going to ask, do you think your job will be taken by AI in the next 10 years?
Perfect. Thank you. I look forward to our next guest answering that.
I wish them luck.
Yes, it is a very interesting conversation to have because different jobs are being taken by AI and other jobs aren't. So it'll be interesting to see who our next guest is who can answer this question.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Shirah. I really appreciate it. And to everybody listening, nothing but amazing things to say about STEaPP. And hopefully, if this all works out, we'll catch up again soon, you and I.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Leah, for your time. I really appreciated hearing more about the fantastic work you're doing. And yes, thank you again so much.
Of course.